welcome to the Mariah Jean Fit YouTube channel. I'm Coach Mariah. Make sure you like our videos, subscribe to our channel, and share our videos as much as possible so we can reach a broader audience. We appreciate your support and enjoy the video. Hello and welcome to another vlog on YouTube and podcast on Spotify by the Fit Minds podcast. Coach Mariah here. Today I'm going to be talking about eating off plan, portion control and flexible meals, how we should be able to do this and when we should do this, and importantly why we need to have flexible meals outside of very specific goals that we may have a limited amount of time to achieve. So what does it look like? It might be a full day of flexible untracked meals, or an untracked meal for a special occasion, or even a meal that hasn't been weighed or meticulously measured in any way. There are many different ways we can approach flexible eating or dieting without tracking our meals. This is something I'm able to do quite naturally in my off-season as a competitor because of my history with tracking and certainly knowledge of macros and calories, in that I'm able to still progress in my strength and my lifts, but I do not necessarily need to track my macros. Now, this isn't recommended for everybody. In fact, there are only seasoned professionals who seem to be able to do this quite well, or certainly somebody who is very good with intuitive eating, but it would be a very small percentage of the population who know how to eat flexibly, remain within, the body composition that they want to be at, and certainly be able to still achieve goals past where they are. So, certainly, in particular given scenarios, eating off-plan would be perfectly acceptable, and there are certain scenarios that an off-plan or untracked meal would likely not align with your goals, or certainly the frequency of having more flexible meals may not align with your goals, given the time frame that you may have to achieve them. So it really just depends. The answer is always it depends, and to what severity that we are eating off-plan, how many calories we are over-consuming, and the list goes on. So let's talk about guilt when eating off-plan. We've all been there, that guilty feeling for eating off-plan or having a flexible meal or day that may not fit your macros or your meal plan. How many times have you done that? Have you slipped off plan, or maybe overeaten your calories, or you've tried to have a meal out with family and friends and you felt really guilty? The major disruptive and intrusive thoughts a client or person may have internally when playing with the ideas of eating off plan may be: what if I go over my calories and ruin all of my progress? This is a very black and white way of thinking and can often be very unnecessary. I may as well keep eating off plan now. I've had one day or one meal off plan. I've ruined all my progress. Again, not a logical thought. I don't know the macros of this meal. I don't even know how many calories are in this meal. I can't have it. And even if I have a special meal with loved ones for an event, I feel as though I am a failure. I must stay on track at all times, and if I do not stay on track, then I have failed my coach or I've failed myself. I really want this donut, chocolate, sandwich, but it's not in my meal plan, so I just can't have it. I wish I could eat off plan, but I'm not allowed to. My coach will be very upset with me and I will be disappointed with myself. My weight has gone up after my flexible meal or day. It's going to take so long to work this off. I feel defeated and like I can't fit flexible meals in. I'm sick of tracking, but I have to track macros to see results, surely. I will skip the dinner with friends because I always feel so guilty going out for meals. I have eaten out a few times this week. I'm useless at staying on my plan. I may as well just give up altogether. So there's kind of that all or nothing approach that we see quite a lot of with clients. I've made a mistake. Why am I even doing this? I can't even stay on track. I'd rather not eat out with my family for that special event. I would rather not ruin my results. I will wait until I'm happy with where I look, what I look like and where I am, and then let myself have a free meal. So this definitely aligns with disordered eating behaviors, which we see as practitioners can easily lead to a very dark and terrible side to tracking and dieting, which unfortunately can lead to obsession and certainly very negative connotations towards flexibility outside of what's on plan. Often we can see with these intrusive thoughts that there is a snowball effect of self-sabotage, whereby a client or person may simply completely slide off plan all week after one decision to have a meal or a snack off plan, or for example, if they've had a meal out, they then might decide that they may as well have dessert as well while they're there. This is usually due to the fact that they may either use overeating as a coping mechanism or eating off plan as a form of self-punishment due to the feelings of self-defeat or low self-worth. So it's almost like I use this idea or this principle with clients that just because you've shot yourself in the left foot doesn't mean you need to shoot yourself in the right. You don't need to create that domino effect after you have fallen slightly off plan. And unfortunately, this is a red flag as a practitioner and something that requires addressing as precedent. So when we do see these kinds of behaviors come up with a client where they are getting a little bit too restrictive with their food, they are having anxiety around food choices and meal times and flexible meals, they are alienating themselves from almost every social event, this is where we start to see that we may need to address this probably more than anything else that we are working on with that client. At times, it may require intervention through referral for psychology sessions to a dietitian for deeper behavioral therapy around food restrictions and disordered eating patterns. One thing that is slightly out of our scope as sports nutritionists, depending on the level of qualification that we have, is going to be things like complex disordered eating behavior that is repetitive and certainly rears its ugly head over and over again. If we do see that as practitioners, we do have to refer outwards to a dietitian or psychologist if we are unable to see any sort of success in maybe some correctional behaviors and things on a basic level. If this is very deep-seated and seems to be repetitive and reoccurring, then it is something that needs to be further addressed with other professionals. And it is a really important thing to see that there is a respect for having numerous professionals involved in a very complicated problem. We don't often treat eating disorders as if they are complicated, but they definitely are, because it's not just about the physical, it's not just about the food, it goes far above and beyond that. So sadly, these behaviors can also be very strict, and restrictive coaching styles will exacerbate them. Or their methods, for example, in that eating off plan or away from macros occasionally is discouraged and even forbidden or frowned upon. So we've all kind of met that PT in our gym that doesn't have a nutrition qualification and is constantly punishing their clients with burpees for eating a piece of birthday cake, or perhaps shunning them when they see them on a Monday after they may have enjoyed a social occasion over the weekend and eaten off plan. This is unfortunately encouraging a very black and white thinking towards a person's eating, and unfortunately this is very difficult to undo as well once a person has ingrained this in their mind as a way of life and habitual behavioral changes and implications of that type of methodology. When is full adherence required or not required? So obviously we need to discuss the implications and the effect of, eating off plan and what that can do to your results. When do we need you to be 100%? When is it possible to be 100%, and what circumstances does that call for? So there are very few circumstances, funnily enough, where 100% full adherence, 365 days a year, is required for weeks and months on end. Comp prep physique shows would be the exception, and perhaps for a very specific goal, there would be the extreme examples of such. Perhaps circumstances like reaching a certain body composition for a photo shoot or your wedding, for example, but much less than a comp prep. So comp prep is pretty much the strictest of strict. Even for example, MMA fighters that may have to make a weight category, there is going to be a very strict set of circumstances for that very small percentage of the population who engage in that type of endeavor, and that they would need to show signs of significant discipline prior to completing a comp prep or commencing one, right? So the full 100% adherence, funnily enough, is not something that we necessarily even encourage in every client's every single day, because you will actually see that this can negatively impact a person's lifestyle and quality of life long term, and certainly their relationship with food. Even with our comp prep clients, we have a specific stage and phase for that very adherent, very strict, restrictive in a sense of calories, that type of diet. And then we obviously then do actually phase them out of that. So the approach that's actually required for goals such as comp prep, we would have a more firm and allocated time frame for tracking meals or following a meal plan to a T, such as 20 to 25 weeks in the maximum duration extending up to perhaps 30 weeks, right? There would be more flexibility at the beginning of this, these stages, where you will start to see a transition over to more adherence and certainly being as accurate as possible with the plan. So if you are that far out from a show, you would find that around that 20-25 week mark, that's when you have to start that 100% adherence. Some coaches will honestly encourage the 30-week mark, but it will depend from person to person as to how long they can endure that for. However, these are set to a particular time frame for a reason, to allow for more flexibility, as I mentioned earlier, outside of this time frame in what's called an off-season, which is what I'm in at the moment. So this is often why you will see me eating ice cream that is not on my plan, that can't be tracked, where I will be eating dinners out with friends and family, and you might think, well, hold on, how is she maintaining a physique and still eating these foods? Must be some sort of magic, right? However, it is just about mindfulness and understanding that flexibility within reason when you don't have a fat loss goal can often be the key, and certainly understanding that when we do implement more flexibility, this is often something that needs to be a practice of balance and trial and error. Less flexibility with meals being off track or off plan should be slowly introduced as the prep time frame nears closer to ensuring, as I mentioned, that a client can actually adhere to the reduced flexibility. So it's not just about getting close to prep and trying to be ready on time and obviously reducing that room for error, but this is also just to prove to the client that they can be adherent and certainly to the coach as well. So this is in the way of comp prep, MMA fighters, maybe even powerlifters as well, where they may be having to make weight for a show or certainly get to a certain conditioned state of the body. Often this is why flexibility of food types and flavors can be beneficial via macro tracking in a prep or even for a Gen Pop client. So this is why I like macro tracking as a coach. Certainly the way that I deliver macro coaching as well is that I actually like to teach my clients everything they need to know about macro coaching so it's a sustainable method. But obviously there are some coaches who really like doing meal plans and like to make the time for that as well. So it's actually okay to use both or one more than the other, and certainly have those instances where if a client does need a meal plan, loves a meal plan, does the best with a meal plan, gets the best results and certainly is the most adherent with a meal plan, it's in those cases that you would, if you're not doing that as a coach, if you're listening to this as a coach, if you don't provide meal plans like I don't anymore, then it's important to refer that client out to somebody who does for a more appropriate fit. But the macro tracking is great because it actually allows the client to consume some of the foods that they enjoy and that they can then incorporate those into their diet themselves. So it then means that they're not heavily reliant on their coach and that they can have the flexibility with the foods they enjoy. This actually allows for higher long-term adherence of a plan, specifically for a client who likes a bit of variety in their diet and who is more inclined to stray from a plan because they miss variety. So more flexibility within reason should be encouraged for Gen Pop clients with a less strict time frame on achieving their results, because obviously with a lot of Gen Pop, it's not like they're going to drop dead if they don't get a six-pack in the next 6 weeks, and the likelihood of them doing that is quite low as well. So often when we work with Gen Pop or everyday clients, and that's actually a majority of my clients, I have a client base of about 50 to 60 clients where I have from any given point in time, maybe 8 to 10 people in my fierce journeys, and always sitting at about 50 for one-on-one clients. Of those clients, I literally only ever have about 25 that might be in prep or leading into a prep, and the other half are going to be everyday people. I find with my everyday clients, it's much easier to implement more flexibility within their everyday weeks, diets and their weeks, because it is something that is far more lifestyle friendly and more sustainable. And even with my off-season clients, which might be, up to 12 or so, maybe 15 of that 25, comp prep clients, I actually encourage just as much, if not more, flexibility for their meals in an off-season than a Gen Pop client, because usually the off-season clients do not have a fat loss goal, they have a muscle growth goal, and that is very much the reverse of being controlled and restrictive of calorie intake. So for lifestyle clients, it might look like discussing and negotiating with your coach around flexible meals, incorporating and allocating a certain number of days or meals for flexibility over a weekly period, or even letting your coach know that you have some events coming up that may call for some flexible meals or untracked or unmeasured periods of time, such as birthdays, anniversaries, date night, or even holiday or travel periods. Often, if you have a great coach, they will work with you in educating you on how to do this. I have instructional videos in my course content on how to do this. I'm doing this vlog to help clients figure out, and certainly non-clients figure out, how to try and do this within flexible eating terms, half tracking, maybe not, or maybe it's a 60-40 split, but it is all dependent on your goals and certainly dependent on your own personality and preferences as well, as to where you find that balance, where you can still achieve results, where you can still have that balance in your lifestyle, and where you are not restricting yourself for very prolonged periods of time. So this is why, having this flexibility, right, is often really beneficial for macro tracking, because you have a flexibility of food types and flavors, and it's great for in a prep or a Gen Pop client, because they get to almost play with their food, is what I would say. And certainly that's a kind of like a trial and error process. It allows them to try meals that they might not like originally, or maybe they can come back to, they can rotate between, and this kind of gives them the autonomy and control over their own food choices, which in the end is pretty much where you want a client to be. So even more flexibility can be implemented for clients, as I mentioned, who are maintaining body composition. So where you don't have a fat loss goal and you're just maybe wanting to gain a bit of muscle and maybe lose a tiny bit of body fat, but mostly muscle, or you want to maintain and you want to improve your fitness levels, okay? So in that instance, in that case, it might be that will allow for more flexibility than, say, a fat loss client, which is not going to be I'm not going to have as many clients that want to grow or gain. We actually have obviously more clients that look at fat loss, but then we might have performance clients that might be, for example, I work with volleyballers and people who are trying to get into police force, and fat loss is not the major goal. So this is where flexibility can come into play, and where we need to be encouraging of more flexibility to allow for those fun foods. So it will differ from person to person, especially if they have not displayed an ability to regulate emotions around flexible meals, as to how many flexible meals or what that looks like from a structural perspective for each client. It's something that requires practice, as I mentioned previously, trial and error, and removing the heavy feelings of guilt related to food choices. So it is a little bit complicated in how we can actually start to do this safely, but it is simple once we start to get into that routine and structure that suits that person. So for lifestyle clients, it might not be the extreme circumstances of a comp prep, right? So, oftentimes through prep, we will actually take a very polar opposite approach, in that if it is your birthday, if it is Christmas, if it is a New Year's celebration, that you need to be on plan if you are in a prep phase. So if you're falling into that 20 to 25 weeks out from prep, depending on whether you're a bikini competitor or not. If so, your prep may not be as long. But if you're looking at, for example, a figure competitor, where we are the most competitive category for natural female bodybuilding for sure, and then from men as well, looking at classic physique and certainly looking at the bodybuilding categories, even men's physique as well, you're looking at having to be ready on time, which would need that consistency across that 20 to 25 weeks plus, right? So you would want to look at really starting to hone that in, and that if there are special occasions that do fall within that prep, that unfortunately you are going to have to eat your prep meals. But it does make it very helpful tracking macros during these periods, again, because it means that it's a great way to navigate the occasions, these set occasions, with a little more flexibility to choose the foods that you can track to meet your requirements as accurately as possible. So I remember being in the middle of a prep once, it was my birthday, and I literally had a little square of trackable noshu cake, which isn't super exciting in your off season, but it was something that I could track. I put a little candle in it, and that was my birthday cake. That was in an extreme circumstance of being in prep for my birthday. And it was that I still didn't miss out on that kind of sentimental experience of my birthday. But again, this is not going to be required for Gen Pop clients. And it should not be, it should be something that coaches are not practicing, with, that they are trying to force clients to miss their birthdays and the like throughout the year for no particular reason. So, why is it important to have flexible meals? I have met many clients who almost refuse to eat off plan, who are very meticulous with their tracking, who are very meticulous with a meal plan, and who actually have come to me to be able to implement more flexibility and to be gentler to themselves, to have a better relationship with food. And you will find that dietitians will often try to do this with clients as well. So sometimes our job as practitioners is not restricting a client, but trying to teach a client how to balance calorie control with calorie flexibility. So the importance of why we need to have flexible meals outside of extreme circumstances like a comp prep or a very specific goal such as making weight for a MMA or powerlifting show. How do we do this successfully, right? So I'm going to explain, why we need to and how we can do this, how we can implement these changes. So basically, I'm going to address some common misconceptions around flexible food choices as well, and why it's not as necessary to be super strict when fat loss is not the goal, because it is all about energy in, energy out. If you are wanting to lose body fat, of course you're going to have to be more precise with the food that you are eating, because it's very easy to tip yourself into a calorie maintenance or surplus by not following the plan as much as possible. In a calorie maintenance or surplus, it can be quite easy to put yourself into an excessive surplus, but it's much harder because obviously you're going to have those hunger cues, you're going to be satiated, you're going to be fuller than usual, and we're less likely to eat a lot more food when we're purposefully already trying to eat a lot more food. So this is also, on par with this idea that we don't want to create a restrict and binge cycle. And this is often part of where we can see people doing this if they are not implementing some flexibility into everyday, dieting and changing their lifestyle. Generally, if your coach is qualified, registered and insured as a sports nutritionist, they will actually encourage reasonable flexibility around your goals, and they'll be able to advise how much flexibility actually may be feasible, if they believe you should be implementing more flexibility or if you need to pull back on things a little bit longer. So basically, if you are reporting back to your coach and you're plateauing weeks and weeks and weeks on end and you have a fat loss goal, often it might be that if you are transparent with your coach and saying, look, I have been eating quite a few meals out, haven't been eating on plan, I've been trying to eat intuitively, I'm not losing body fat still, this can point towards the culprit, the very obvious answer of, okay, well, maybe we're being a little bit too flexible with our meals. And this is where, unfortunately, for those who are really triggered by data and tracking and weighing their food, the fact of it is that you will be required to do this in order to purposefully decrease your calories. You do need to measure food items in order to understand that you're in a calorie deficit. The ultimate goal is to get you to a point where you don't need to do this as much. Obviously, once you have reached your goal, and that maintenance is the ultimate goal, right? That is the ultimate goal for anybody. But in any given period of time, in any scenario, right, there needs to be almost chunks of time where we have regular days or occasions allowing for flexibility. So it could be a day, it could be a meal each week, but it needs to be fairly consistent for that particular goal. So that period of time, if you're in a calorie deficit, you're going to want to say, okay, we're going to do one flexible meal a week maybe, because it might then tie in with some special occasions. It might look like doing a full day of flexible eating. You might have a lot better of an idea of intuitive eating and be a little bit better with being able to estimate and not go over the top. But it's got to be different per person. We need to have some sort of regular days or occasions allowing for flexibility to be implemented in any case for any athlete or Gen Pop client, period. So outside of these extreme 20 to 25 week preps, and as I mentioned, sporting endeavors where we're trying to make weight, there should be a period of time where we have flexibility. So this is to help in preventing disordered eating patterns, okay? Extreme or damaging relationships with certain food groups or food in general, right? So it's basically to help you have a better relationship with food, because people assume that when you're eating on plan, that you're following a diet, that you are killing it at life and you have this amazing relationship with food. And unfortunately, that's not always the case. It can sometimes actually breed disordered eating patterns and behaviors if we are restrictive for long periods of time without any sort of reason to be so. Now, it can help having more flexibility prevent anxiety in social situations or dysregulation of emotions around untracked meals or days, okay? So as we slowly almost wean people off of this very extreme version of dieting into more flexibility within reason and understanding their bodies and a little bit more intuitive eating here and there, being able to eat out at social occasions, etc., without having an anxiety attack, you would find that the person is actually having a better time of life. They are able to enjoy the meals that they are eating when they are eating out, and that they are not feeling that they are impacting their results dramatically by doing so on odd occasion. Becoming obsessed with clean eating only, or tracking every morsel of food, following a meal plan for months or even years on end, I've seen in some cases, which is actually quite sad to see that someone has got to that point and that a coach has not picked this up, that they have had them on a very strict chicken and rice meal plan for 7 years or 8 years. This is really concerning, that a person has basically been a slave to a meal plan for that period of time, and that eating outside of that sees that they are often dysregulated with food and very anxious about food types outside of their meal plan. So this is not a good thing, right? We should not be eating obsessively, because this can lead to some pretty awful mental and physical health issues long term. And I've been that person, I was in those shoes, 10 years ago as an anorexic bulimic. I was obsessed with tracking. I don't often like to talk from personal perspective as a practitioner, meaning that I apply it to the general population, but I've been in that position where it was obsessive, and I can tell you now that life outside of that is a lot more enjoyable, it is a lot more peaceful, and certainly not as stressful, and I don't experience the anxiety around food that I used to. So it's not a good thing trying to be obsessed with clean eating or not being able to fit in some foods that are off plan, etc. And it can see that a client very quickly loses their ability to eat intuitively. So, if anything's off plan, it kind of sends them into this spiral, or they basically avoid it altogether. And they often develop strong anxiety around food choices and food types. So it's not just what to choose, but they then actually end up looking at certain foods like bread, like ice creams as, no, I can't have those because they're not on my plan. Or even things that can't be tracked. I can't have that brownie from the cafe because it's not on my plan, so I'm just going to avoid it altogether. And so this is where we start to see that they basically think that anything that can't be tracked in their diary, or certainly anything that's not on their meal plan, is evil and terrible, and it's going to make them, gain all this body fat, which is not the case at all. We know that food is not that's not how food works, and that there are not magical foods that are great for fat loss and magical foods that aren't great for fat loss. It's just literally a case of each food item that has been made has ingredients that have been put into it that will have a calorie value depending on how much of each ingredient they've used. And there are micronutrient requirements, sure, for those who are obsessed with clean eating. Yes, it is important to get your micronutrients in, but it is not the basis nor the center of your diet, in that you need to focus only on that. There are small parts of fun foods that should be incorporated into your diet, especially if you like them. There are no foods that should be completely off limits and, where you have a coach saying, never eat this food ever in your whole life or you're a bad person. Sadly, it's still an all too common practice in coaching, and it needs to stop. Okay, if I have a coach listening to this podcast and they disagree with me, I will happily debate this with you. There are foods that are higher in saturated fats, things like deep fried foods or processed foods that we do want to limit our consumption of. You don't need to necessarily stop eating it altogether, but you want to try and reduce the consumption thereof. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to cut them out of your diet completely, but it's pretty much one of the only major food rules that we kind of have outside of standard macro, breakdown guidelines for each individual person. And obviously outside of your fruit and veggie intake, trying to get balanced whole foods. I always have to stress that as well, because I'll address this later in the podcast, but it's something that I see where people start tracking and they can go in the opposite direction, where they just eat nothing but what they feel like instead of actually thinking about micronutrient intake. This can also be closely related to, so this type of behavior, the obsessive clean eating and the, having to weigh every single thing, even if you're not in a comp prep, and having to be right on the dot with your calories, even if you're not in comp prep. It can be very closely related to the mentality of a clothing size or weight obsession beyond healthy goals, right? So where people are trying to reduce their weight below what would be considered, and we'll focus on body fat percentage for the sake of, health, so to speak, below what would be considered healthy for them to achieve their standard hormonal markers. For women, it's getting their cycle, and for men, it's obviously going to be other hormonal markers, and even just in general micronutrient intake, etc. So when we start to get into those lower body fat percentages and people do become very scale obsessed, unfortunately, this can be closely linked with behaviors of what's called orthorexia, which people don't often talk about, but is the obsession of clean eating. And I would like to know that there will be a branch of this fairly soon, which is not clean eating, so to speak, but maybe an obsession with not eating anything that isn't on your plan, an obsession with basically tracking macros and eating on a meal plan. And the reason why it can be very closely related, obviously, as we know, to clothing size or weight obsession, is because it's very data driven. It's numbers, it's all about obsession, and it's all about trying to be a certain number instead of actually thinking about a holistic value of your appearance, your well-being, how you feel, and your other health markers such as your hormones, your blood, your blood levels, your iron levels, for example, which unfortunately can actually be quite low and be impacted by long prolonged dieting phases, and certainly sustaining lower body fat levels for prolonged periods of time. So it's often assumed that this healthy eating and super healthy lifestyles and tracking your macros all the time and making sure you are on point with your meal plans and you're a certain clothing size and you're a certain body fat percentage, sadly doesn't always align with what would be considered as a healthy individual. So when does eating out or off plan affect my progress? Okay, I'm sure you want to know. Well, hold on. Okay, Mariah, we're talking about flexibility, but let's be realistic. When is it going to make me gain body fat? When am I going a little bit too far with this flexi eating? And when have I gone too far with flexi eating? Probably a couple times, to be completely honest, this year. But you can always pull it back in. That's the important thing to remember, is that nothing is permanent when it comes to food. It changes, it's a 24-hour turnaround, then it's a 48-hour turnaround, and it's a 7-day turnaround, where we have changes that can be made, as we see from dieting, or we see from doing the opposite of dieting, where you can go up and down in different compositions and it can change. So it's important to know that when you do make a mistake or when you do blow out, that's not permanent, and it's a really a very logical thing to start to think about is, hold on, I can come back from this. I actually can recover. This is not forever. So when does it actually affect my progress? Despite the importance of implementing some flexible meals, snacks, or days, there is going to be a degree of flexibility which will only see you doing something similar to what you were doing before. So if you're going on a fat loss goal and you're in a deficit, you're tracking macros, or you're on a meal plan and you started eating some flexible meals here and there, and all of a sudden you're ordering Uber Eats every second day, and then it kind of just snowballs, and on the weekends you're out drinking, and then bam, you're back where you were before. And you're thinking to yourself, hold on, I'm really good with my macros. Like at least Tuesday and Thursday and maybe Sunday, half the day I followed my macros. So it should be working, right? Unfortunately, that's not the case. If we use and implement too much flexibility, if we have not responsibly figured out how to do that, within reason, or we haven't reached a goal and then wanted to maintain, if we're going through a fat loss phase and we go crazy on the flexibility, you will literally just see yourself doing what you were doing prior to that fat loss phase. You know, you will basically be implementing an excess of flexibility. So it's important to understand that flexibility it can only be full flexibility if you are a well-versed professional in doing this, and certainly someone who might be a coach or has lots of practice with it, or if you're a great intuitive eater and you've had a great past with it. But if you haven't had a great past with it, then you will need to keep your flexible meals and days in check. So in that you may not see results, you know, in this process as well, if you're eating too flexibly, perhaps you might see them, these flexi days basically impacting the progress is going to be slower. So you might lose a couple 100 grams of body fat, you know, each week, but you're going to lose less than what you would lose if you were following the plan a bit more closely. So it can sometimes look like swapping out some of that flexibility for a little bit more of following your plan, and where you start to see it be more in favor of you losing body fat. And that's, again, just to do with energy balance, right? You're just getting back to being in that calorie deficit where your body is able to actually access body fat stores to burn, versus the flexible meals that might be throwing you over your total calories for the whole week. And it's just basically bringing it back down again a little bit so that you can be in a better position to actually see and experience results. So you will probably see that if you do it too much, it will be a lot slower, or you will completely plateau. Perhaps the flexible eating habits are a little too liberal and a little too regular, which is very important to be accountable for. Self-accountability and transparency with your coach, with your coach and yourself, is key. Without the accountability for food choices, we can see excessive fat gain and health issues arise, okay? So when we basically start to be like a kid in a candy shop and going a little bit crazy with food, of course we're going to see an aftermath. We're going to see an impact from that. It's kind of how it works. It's how fat gain works. After all, our fat loss or gain relies on the principle of energy in the way of total calories consumed that you eat across a week. Generally, we find it's across a week because you can have those fluctuating days with calories and it can kind of even out a little bit there and here and there. But it's the total calories across the week versus the energy across the week that we are using up, right? So the energy that we're burning, and obviously across each day, adding up to that week. On the other hand, eating strictly on plan, day in, day out, can sadly also encourage a very extreme attitude towards either dieting or everyday eating. So people kind of see that, I'm either on a diet or I'm eating like an asshole. I'm either on a diet or I'm eating like an asshole. And unfortunately, there's this real separation between the two. The way I like to look at it is that when I'm in an off season or when I'm maintaining, and I encourage this with everyday people, when you don't have a specific fat loss goal, you're happy with where you are, you're cruising for a little bit, or you maybe want to gain a little bit of muscle and you don't really need to be that worried about calories, you still want to eat foods that you enjoy. You still want to eat wholesome foods, but you want to be in a position where when you do want to diet again, which is just reducing your total calorie intake, that you don't need to make huge drastic changes to your dietary choices, that you can start to tweak and change things to be a little bit more macro and calorie friendly. But all in all, you're not changing the way that you eat too dramatically. It's possibly just the amounts of certain foods and foods that are going to be less calorie dense. It might look like, for example, swapping your crumpets or your bread that might be 250 calories for 2 slices and you're not really bothered by it. You don't have to get rid of that. You could literally just, if you're in a calorie deficit, change that to, 2 slices of country split bread. It's one of my favorite brands for dieting because it's literally 110 calories for 2 slices. So it's half the amount of calories for the same amount of slices. And this is how you can still sustain having your toast without necessarily having to, cut out food groups, and where we can create a lifestyle that can then be adjusted for your different phases and goals. So, whereas, as I mentioned, and I kind of almost got to this idea in previous points, is that you should be able to slowly phase out of this reduced calorie period. So you should never be in a calorie deficit period for a prolonged period of time. So you should never be tracking for a prolonged period of time so meticulously that it has to be completely on point without breaks or without diet breaks or without special events, etc. And not just that, when you have got to your goal, it's important to phase out of constant tracking and to phase out of being in a calorie deficit, because you no longer need to be in that deficit. You can actually increase the calories upwards. So a common misconception is that if you've been dieting, that you need to continue dieting and eating those low level of calories, and it's not the case. If you don't need to lose fat anymore, you don't need to be in a calorie deficit. So when we phase clients out of that to everyday eating, we need to be able to get to a point where you can go back to everyday eating, but implement some of the strategies that you learnt in your dieting phases for maybe some food swaps, and maybe some extra calories here and there, some flexible meals, etc., and understanding the calorie content and certainly portions of certain food groups, which is going to favor your maintenance, is going to favor the lifestyle that you now have. So this way you don't then end up going back to the old lifestyle and back to the old food choices that may have seen you very easily overconsume calories, and then obviously, kind of reverse the body fat that you were originally trying to lose in order to get to that healthy level of body fat, for general health. So you see this quite a lot where people will go through a dieting phase, they'll just diet, but then they will go back to what they were doing before and think that the fat will just stay off. And unfortunately, without making adjustments to total calories again, of course you're going to end up back where you were, because that's literally how you got there. So it is your coach's job to educate you in allowing for this to become a lifestyle and to inform you of the applied methods or approaches and outcomes around acquiring this balance for long-term success and sustainability of your lifestyle changes and results. So in short, your coach needs to work with you in teaching you how, why, what, etc., etc., so that it's not something that is foreign to you, so that it's not something that is guesswork to you, so that it's something that you can take away from coaching. And unfortunately, coaches often hold their cards very close to their chest with information because they're afraid of losing clients. They're afraid of a client graduating. They're afraid of a client learning enough to go off on their own. I'm the polar opposite. I want to get a client to a point where they know enough to go off on their own. Outside of specific sports requirements, I want a client to be able to learn what I know or enough to apply to their everyday lifestyle so that it becomes second nature. So mistakes and misconceptions about eating out or when eating out, because this is often, I think, where a lot can be undone, unfortunately. What we may often not consider is that we may even not be eating enough calories when eating a flexible meal. We can grossly over or underestimate the total calories in a meal untracked or unmeasured for many reasons. So looks are deceiving when it comes to eating out with meals. You really don't have any idea. Most people don't have any idea of the calories contained in any given meal that they're eating out because they're very unaware of the total amount of calories per ingredient because they don't know what ingredients have been used. Sometimes defaulting to eating the salad at the restaurant might see that you don't get enough protein or carbs for the day, and this may leave you feeling hungry and not satisfied, potentially lower in energy, and this can lead to snacking or binging on other foods later in the day or evening to compensate. So it's interesting, the salad is not always the best choice because the salad may not actually satiate you and you may not end up with what you bargained for. You may end up with not enough protein or carbs to satiate or give you energy. Sometimes if we default to eating a salad at the restaurant, it may even contain more total calories than, say, the burger. I know, shock horror. Salads like Caesar salads or even Greek salads can often have added oils, bacon, breads, etc. to blow the calories out without us even realizing. So weirdly enough, if we assess things like Caesar salads for the total nutritional content and the calories contained, yes, they can have more calories than a burger. It's wild. But however, in cases of, for example, where a burger is triple stacked with patties and it's got, 3 slices of cheese, well, obviously very clearly that's going to be more calorie dense than a burger that has a single patty, a single slice of cheese and lettuce and tomato. Why? Because you can see there that, there are very calorie dense foods being used in larger amounts. So there are going to be circumstances where you can tell that a food will be very calorie dense, and there are going to be circumstances where you might not be able to unless you are, as I said, well versed in understanding calorie content of sauces, dressings, deep fried foods, etc. And it actually is liquid calories in the way of oils, dressings, juices, soft drinks, alcohols that can be hidden and blow up a meal past the calories of what you're assuming are in it. So there are some common misconceptions that lie around making smart choices with foods, as it's not always what it seems when it comes to restaurants, cafes, takeaway meals, right? So we think we're making a smart choice, and unfortunately, looks are deceptive, usually if it's really tasty. It can sometimes be really calorie dense, but it's also not the case, As I said previously, a burger that's really tasty can actually sometimes be not as high in calories as what we believe it to be, because it's a fairly balanced meal if it doesn't contain, 3 different sauces, 3 slices of cheese, a crazy amount of burger patties, a piece of bacon, some chips, etc. And that, obviously the calories will slowly add up. So it's important to understand the components of the meal that may contribute to total calories. Here's where we start to really learn. Ingredients such as condensed calorie items, right? Items that just have a higher energy value, they just do. Such as sauces, dressings, butters, oils, liquid calories. So you can even have had butter added to your vegetables or to your toast and you don't even know it's been done. And that's where we can have some hidden calories, literally hidden under your eggs. Eggs Benedict. The Eggs Benedict sauce is the most calorie dense sauce that exists. It's awful. It's got so much oil and butter. I mean, it's not awful. It's obviously delicious. But you will see that that sauce contains more calories than both of your slices of bread on your plate, and even more calories than the 2 eggs that you're eating. So it does add up over time, and certainly it's a common misconception that if a meal looks healthy, that it's going to be, lower in calories, for example. So other things to look out for would be things like liquid calories, as I mentioned, so a juice, soft drink, alcohol, added sugars, creams, animal fats, etc. The list goes on. Anything that really comes in a liquid form, is probably going to be fairly calorie dense, aside from a couple of exceptions like pure vinegar and lemon juice, because they just don't have a large amount of calories in them. It may see a meal, as I said, contain higher calories than we realize without necessarily visibly looking like a larger meal to the eye. A great example is processed or deep fried food to some degree. If you've got a chicken schnitzel, I know everyone loves them, but if you've got some fried fish and it might be crumbed or whatever, when they've been deep fried, we don't know how much oil has been used, and often the oil can be used and we don't even realize there's quite a lot of oil, in that food item because it tastes delicious. So, in some cases, meals may come out as smaller portions as well. So, when you look on the menu and you go, I'm gonna get that looks great. And it comes out smaller. And so then we can often underestimate the calories, and it kind of gets a little bit difficult there because we don't know what a meal is gonna look like when it, before it comes out. So then it may have less calories than we would have thought, or, we might be able to choose items from a menu that seem to be less calorie dense than others. So we can make a lot of assumptions when eating out about food, and often we can be a little bit far from the actual truth, or the portion sizes. You could ask for chips and the chips could be, this big versus this big, it could be a massive portion versus a small portion. So how do we get around that? How do we get around figuring out what to do with portion sizes and what to eat? But again, going back to that burger concept, if it only has 1 patty, 1 slice of cheese, lettuce, tomato, onion, perhaps 1 sauce, if it's served with additional sauce, if it has 2 or 3 sauces, you can just ask them to not put them on there and just have 1 sauce. So that way you're only having 1 type of sauce. You could simply ask for no sauce with something, sauce on the side, so you can just use what you need sparingly. And perhaps if it has 2 sauces, as I mentioned, maybe you might have a dressing and there might be a cream sauce on it. It usually it tells you what sauces it comes with. You can then simply request that you have them served separately, and that way you're not covering it in sauce and you just use what you need. How do we eat out or off plan? So that's the next topic I'm going to move on to. How do we do it? So now I've kind of talked about common misconceptions, mistakes, and obviously it's probably going to get you pretty confused because you're thinking to yourself, well, how do I eat out? I don't know, that they could be hiding calories everywhere. It's like they're like little gremlins and they're just going to come out and, surprise us like, oh, I'm an extra 1,000 calories and you didn't even know. Calorie gremlins, love it. How do we eat out or off plan? So how do we find this balance to eat off plan? For those who struggle with doing this, much of this is simply normalizing the idea that one meal once a week, or even a few meals, maybe 2, are not going to derail you or negatively impact your results due to some magic reason that the food is awful for you, unless those meals are really calorie dense. If you're ordering a kebab and you've got chips on the side and you decide to have, a Bavarian dessert, and then you decide to have some chocky as well, and you go, well, that's just one meal, that could throw out your calories for the week if you are consuming enough calories in one sitting, yes. However, if it's a reasonable meal and it's just portioned and you're being aware of those, other factors such as excess oils and fluids, etc., you might be in a position where you are overthinking it and thinking it's impacting you more than it actually is. Some additional calories won't be damaging to you if you're at a maintenance or surplus level of calories, okay? So that's important, is that there's not some sort of magical thing that says that if you're in maintenance or surplus and you eat a meal out, that all of a sudden you're magically unhealthy and you're going to die. If you're in a deficit, it may impact your results, but only to a certain extent, and that depends on how often you eat out, okay? How many extra calories you're consuming, and if it's enough to throw you out of a deficit. That's the facts for the week. That's it, right? Again, yes, you can do it in one sitting. Yes, you can overconsume your calories for the week on average because you've had a massive meal, a massive binge in one sitting. You're probably going to be aware of that because you're not going to feel very good, okay? Especially even with alcohol consumption in conjunction with eating meals out, where you might be eating a ton of calories whilst you're at a party and then you're consuming a ton of alcohol. Yes, that can throw out your whole week if you're in a calorie deficit, okay? And yes, if you're in a surplus or maintenance, it will just put you further into a surplus. So this is what's important to understand. You also probably won't be hitting your macros properly on that day and to a T, but that's not as important if you're in maintenance or surplus once a week. Definitely more important when you are in a deficit that you are hitting your macros, because it's where you can underconsume protein, and that's where it's probably a lot more important to consume your level of protein required when you're in a deficit, due to being able to feel fuller for longer and obviously maintaining your muscle mass. If you gain weight overnight, much of this will be extra glycogen. So it's basically carbs that haven't been used as energy. It's not body fat. And we can see that this will come from a more calorie dense meal. If you've eaten a larger meal, you end up with extra calories. Use it for your workout the next day. It'll be one of the best workouts you've ever had. It takes 3,500 calories over on top of your total energy requirement, right, and energy expenditure for the day to gain just 500 grams of body fat, roughly. It's approximate. This is not for every single person, but this is the stats that we use to try and talk to clients about. That's how much you have to overeat your calories over the top of your maintenance level, not even your deficit, your maintenance level calories, to be able to gain 500 grams of body fat overnight, okay? It is possible to do it. Again, you probably feel very sick, but the more common process for body fat gain over a week is because it is gradual overconsumption of calories, which is much easier to do. So never panic after having a meal or a day off plan, as long as obviously you haven't eaten like an absolute asshole for the whole day. And even then, don't panic, because resetting the next day, don't reset on Monday, reset the next day or meal. You have the choice to do the next meal, and remember that it's not the end of the world and you do not need to keep sabotaging yourself. In fact, it's just going to make you feel worse if you do. It's just one day or one meal and does not have to continue, okay? It doesn't have to keep going. You can stop it whenever you want to. You don't have to carry guilt with it either, because obviously you've already eaten the food, it's done, move forward, it's not permanent, and that it actually takes less time than you would realize if you just get back to what you were doing. If it's spread across the week, right? If you're slightly over-consuming calories across the week, you can easily put yourself into maintenance. That's why a lot of people plateau, because they may not be overeating, but because they're hungry, they're kind of snacking here and there. They're taking themselves to a point where they're not hungry anymore, but they know they probably couldn't eat anymore because they're full. And so this is where we see lots of plateaus happen. If it's spread across the week, the slow overconsumption of calories, maybe once a day, once every 2 days, then yes, you can slowly either maintain and plateau or gain body fat slowly over time from overconsuming calories daily. That's how people gain body fat, That's the most common way to gain body fat. And unfortunately, where people kind of start scratching their heads is literally because they're not doing it on purpose. You will see people who binge eat, absolutely, who gain body fat, but a lot of people are just accidentally over-consuming calories daily because they don't understand total energy intake. Now, that's probably more likely, okay? So it's not the once-offs that will impact you as much as it is the constant times falling off plan. So very important to understand that. That weight spike is a weight spike, but it's not going to stay there. It takes a couple of days for it to settle down once you're back on plan, or once you're back on track. Let yourself have a meal out occasionally and remove the guilt, okay? I'm saying this as a nutritionist and just in general, as a person who understands what it's like to eat flexibly and also have control with portions and understanding, calorie intake. It's a balance. Be transparent with your coach about the exact frequency of meals off plan for the week. So always be honest with them because they are walking blind if you don't tell them. If you said I followed my macros all week and I've been absolutely amazing and everything's on point, and you went out drinking with the girls on the weekend and you had, a cheat meal, I hate that term, but you had a cheat meal and you didn't tell your coach, and let's say you didn't drop for the fortnight, you haven't got your cycle, etc., they're probably going to be scratching their heads and go, oh well, I'll drop the calories, obviously we've adapted, we aren't dropping here, this isn't a true deficit, let's go down. And all of a sudden, you've lost calories for absolutely no reason. If your coach knows that you've eaten off plan, then they can take that into account and probably have an idea of what you might have overconsumed, and then they can go, cool, I probably don't need to drop your calories because you didn't even hit them last week. So let's just stay where we are and we're in a good spot. Let's try it again. This means you don't miss out on those calories. You don't even need to miss out on those calories because obviously that deficit will work if you are following it without those, random nights out with the girls every single weekend. So this gives them an idea of what to do with your calories or not do with your calories. And if they perhaps don't even need to change them, obviously, as I mentioned, because you took yourself out of a deficit. And that is why honesty is key with your coach. Your coach, if they're a good coach, they're not going to get angry. They're going to be like, hey, thanks for telling me. Cool, now I know where to go with that. Focus on portions, okay? Portion control is often overlooked, and certainly people kind of roll their eyes because I don't know what a portion is. It's pretty simple, but a lot of it is also understanding that the extra ingredients, oils, sauces, etc., they have to be used sparingly or certainly consumed sparingly because of the calorie dense nature, especially when you're in a calorie deficit. Half a plate of full veggies or salad is the general rule of thumb. This is available on the government website for guidelines for eating, okay? This is a no-brainer and I don't know why I have to keep repeating myself. However, it's still available. You can have a look at the guide for healthy eating. I don't know whether it's still called that. I think it's called something else, but it's actually pretty good. Our food pyramid, stop blaming the food pyramid. Our food pyramid is actually fantastic. It's the fact that we're not thinking about the fine details of, hold on, I did drink a lot over the weekend. Alcohol does have calories, so does mixers. Hold on, yeah, I had that deep fried meat and I had the chips and oh, that's right, I had that, random, dessert that I decided to start eating at 3 o'clock in the morning. So this is where accountability comes in. This is where we have to be accountable for our choices and decisions. But focusing on portions looks like half a plate of veggies. I could rant on about this for ages, right? Half a plate of veggies, so of a dinner plate, without butter or sauce. Let's just focus on this for now. A quarter of carbs of any sort, okay? So a quarter of the plate with carbs of any sort, and a quarter of a leaner cut of meat. Be mindful of fattier cuts of meat, such as pork with rind, lamb, fattier beef cuts, and chicken thighs. If you're going to have them, just keep in mind that maybe having a fatty or oil-dense sauce is probably going to throw you over because fats are very dense in calories. They're much higher per gram in calories for the volume that they take up, for the amount of room they take up on your plate. They have much higher calories than carbs and protein do, and per gram of that particular macro, it has more calories as well. So it's not only more dense, but it just has more calories in general per gram when we measure it, okay? And that's not gram weighed, that's just how many fats are in that food, yeah? So when we understand this, it means that when you go and eat out and you say for example, you're looking at having half a plate of salad, quarter of carbs, quarter of meat, maybe just try to choose the leaner, cut or portion of meat. Maybe ask for no butter on your veggies, or if you are having butter on your veggies, maybe have the leaner cut of meat. Be mindful of the fats, carbs, and protein in veggies. Veggies are great for filling you up. Having more of those is always a good thing. Very difficult to do when you're eating out because it's often not an option, but this can help you with focusing on smarter choices for when you're eating out. Funnily enough, a burger, the bun is carbs, the meat is the protein, the cheese is the fats. There's a little bit of fats on the meat as well. The sauce will have a little bit of fats in it as well, maybe a little bit of carbs. But all in all, not too bad. Lettuce, tomato, that's a little bit of fiber, veggies in there, some micronutrients in the tomato. Again, not the devil, not a terrible meal, quite balanced. Doesn't have a lot of fats, probably has more than preferred for that meal, but it's not going to be, for example, as imbalanced as an entire pizza that might, for example, have a shit ton of carbs and a shit ton of fats and not a lot of protein. And obviously total calories will be quite high. The more fats and oils and cheeses they use on that pizza is going to obviously rack up. So you can look at also with snacks and flexibility of snacks, replacing your usual snacks with one calorie dense snack and focus on, like, for example, if you want to have a loaded donut, hell yeah, have the loaded donut. But focus on hitting your total protein for the day at minimum. So eyeballing your foods, estimating protein amounts for the portions can be helpful, and it can be helpful to already know kind of what protein content is in a meat if it's cooked by eyeballing it. It's easy to know that if you've already researched it prior, and there aren't that many meats that exist on this earth, so it's easy to figure that out over time. So you can literally track that in MyFitnessPal and then slowly figure out what the cooked version might look like. And then often in some circumstances, they might have the weighed amount on the menu, 200-gram rump of steak rump. That will actually give you an indication of how much protein, if you know before going, that you would be eating, okay? Chicken breast, same thing. If there's a chicken breast served, they will vary in size, but this is about, if you're having snacks that are off plan, prioritizing your protein, because more often than not, those snacks will not be very high in protein. They'll be higher in carbohydrates and fats, but you can still have them. There are carbs and fats in your meal plan or in your macros. You can still have them. It's just about thinking about your day as a holistic picture. So added calories are usually hidden in greasy foods, sauces, deep fried foods, battered foods. Factor in some extra calories for this meal, okay? If you're gonna have a more calorie dense meal, maybe don't have a huge lunch if you're eating out for dinner. It doesn't mean starve yourself, just have your usual lunch, maybe don't have your snack in the afternoon. There are lots of different ways where you can account for or try and factor in the additional calories if you're in a calorie deficit. If you're in a maintenance or surplus, don't worry about it. Eat the meal, don't try and factor it in, just eat it. Maybe, as I mentioned, maybe you could skip your morning tea if you're having a lunch out, but sometimes it can actually help you having the snack before you go, your normal snack, because then you're not as hungry when you're making decisions with the menu. That way you can, you're not you when you're hungry, that whole idea. You can actually make better choices if you've had a snack before you've gone, because then you're not thinking from a perspective of being super hungry and where your eyes are bigger than your belly. Alcohol has calories. Alcohol has calories. Like literally pure vodka has calories. Every shot of alcohol has calories. So does dessert, okay? Dessert is not this magical thing. I wish it was, because I love dessert. We don't have a second stomach for dessert. Alcohol has calories. So does dessert. Maybe decide if you want to drink, then skip dessert, or simply listen to your hunger cues, or even just limit your alcohol consumption. You do not need to get white girl wasted. You do not need to have 30 drinks and show everybody your party tricks. You can count your drinks, and you can get to a point where you're pacing yourself across the day. It's not just about not being blind, rotten drunk and making a fool of yourself. It's also about the fact that you've got to think about your health, how it impacts your health, and certainly if you are trying to be mindful of calorie consumption, this is one of the best ways to start, is how frequently am I drinking alcohol, how much am I drinking, and how much is this impacting my overall total calories for the week. Obviously then if you limit yourself to a couple of drinks, great, because then you're not going over too far and you're still enjoying your time. And and obviously if you are drinking, maybe you could look at skipping dessert. Maybe you don't need to have dessert as well. Know when you've had enough alcohol or food. Know when you've had enough. You do not need to binge on alcohol or food. Binge drinking and binge eating are not too dissimilar in that you just take it too far. So know when you've had enough, start to be more aware of those signs, hunger cues. If you're feeling full, don't laugh and keep eating and go, oh, I'm full, but I'm just going to keep eating because it's still here. This is all the type of stuff where we start to see that people normalize the concept of over-consuming food to a point of making themselves feel sick, or over-consuming alcohol to the point where they no longer remember anything from their evening. That is basically your body's way of saying, oi, I've had enough, that was awful. The food will always be there when you go out to events, okay? So if there's a food item that you don't like, sushi or something like that, or you think, nah, I don't really, I'm not really for that food, it's always gonna be there. Sushi is a food that exists. I often look at foods when I go out to social events and things, and if I look at the menu and I'm not a big fan of a side dish and someone says, do you want to order that? I don't particularly want it because even if I don't feel like it at the time, it's easier to not order it. But also it's like, I can get that any other time that I come back. I don't need to order everything. I can be selective with what I want and know that yes, chips will be there in weeks to come. I don't need to get chips every time if I don't feel like chips, and I can make choices. You can always make choices between foods. Foods aren't going anywhere, so you don't need to eat all of the different types of foods all at once. Learn to listen to your body and be mindful before food choices come into play, okay? You have to use your brain for this. I know, right? It seems foreign. Use your brain, think about your food choices. It will contribute greatly before you put it in your mouth. Think before you eat, but don't obsess. Don't panic. Okay, just think calmly about perhaps eating the foods that you like and skipping the ones that you don't perhaps need to eat in the same night. It is actually a very simple concept. Don't eat it if you don't feel like having it. Don't eat it just because it's there. Don't eat it just because it's there. When on holidays, try the 3 mains and 1 snack idea. That I've seen actually work quite well for a lot of people. Keep an eye on alcohol consumption or frequency. So you don't have to drink every single night you're on holidays, for God's sake. You'll probably feel awful if you do that. But if you're on holidays, sure. It's like if you consume alcohol on holidays, that's a choice. If you don't consume alcohol on holidays, don't do it from a perspective of thinking that you can't. You can, it's a holiday. Choose and pick your occasions for consuming extra calories. You don't have to say yes to every single social occasion and drinking opportunity. A Coke Zero never hurt anybody in place of a wine. I know that seems like a funny joke, but I've done it plenty of times myself and I'm fine. And this can often then prevent you from repeatedly over-consuming your calories every single weekend and potentially throwing out your entire week's calories and then beating yourself up on Monday and deciding to start your diet again. This is where the cycle continues. You can have a laugh. It's not funny. It's kind of stupid. Like, it's just stupid choices over and over again and not reflecting upon it. Make smarter choices more frequently, but you don't have to take the extremes of completely cutting everything out all the time altogether. What if we're struggling with eating off plan too much? Okay, so I'll finish up with this concept. Structure is key. Okay, with any sort of change in your diet, we must approach any method with as much consistency as possible. So whether it is tracking altogether for 6 days and not 1, or whether it's tracking mostly except 1 meal, or whether it's following a meal plan and having a flexible meal occasionally on special events, if that works for you and you're getting the results you want, you can probably follow that consistently until it doesn't work, and then we obviously have to change it again, right? But the idea is that you want to follow it as consistently as possible without the risk of relapsing into binging and depriving cycles, okay? So basically, if you're finding that you're getting to 4 or 5 weeks and you're like, oh my God, I want to eat a burger, I'm dying, this is awful. Okay, you might need to reassess where your calories are at with your coach. Maybe they're a little bit too low for your energy requirements, but also in general. You might have an event coming up where you can have the burger, or a date night, for example, is a great opportunity for having a burger. It might not be a terrible thing for you to have that, get it out of the way, and then just keep going, okay? So your structure will look different for you as it will for anybody else as to what will work sustainably for you, but it has to look like preventing things from sliding south and the repeated cycles that you're seeing there. Try to aim for as much consistency as you can with your plan, okay? Yes, absolutely, but don't beat yourself up for not being 100% 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Because unfortunately that then means that any time outside of your plan that you are trying to enjoy life, that you're not enjoying life and you're not enjoying, that flexibility that you should learn how to enjoy. Then, obviously, if you're looking for reasons or ways to cheat from your plan, it may look like discussing fitting in some foods that you like, okay, with your coach instead of looking for ways to cheat on your plan. So it might look like finding ways to fit these in your macros and having smaller amounts of these daily. So I'm a big chocolate fan. I like to have a little bit of chocolate every day, and guess what? It means I don't then feel like I'm being deprived, missing out on chocolate, and then want to eat a whole block every week or every month. I have a small amount every day, and therefore I then don't actually have to worry about that being a food that is off limits. It's just not off limits. It fits my macros, or it fits my current diet choices. I'm happy with where I'm sitting, and know the magical small piece of chocolate I have daily does not throw my calories out where I gain crazy amounts of body fat. Planning ahead, okay? Do your grocery shop online. Planning ahead is everything for preventing yourself from constantly eating too flexibly and maybe ordering Uber Eats every second day. Grocery shop online, meal prepping so you have meals ready to go. And there are so many ways that you can create structure, but you need to create structure in order for you to be able to follow it. Factor in the time to meal prep into your diary. Make a reminder. Make it the same day every single week. Maybe have some ready-made macro-friendly meals ordered to your door if you don't have time to meal prep. There are lots of companies that provide these options. But repetition is key, right? To ingrain a habit, we must repeat the process. To ingrain a habit, we must repeat the process. If the process is not working and that habit is really difficult to follow, even after weeks and months, you have to reassess how you're approaching it, and certainly reassess your attitude towards the terms around that process as well. So it might look like that you might be taking things to extremes. You might be trying to eat too clean. You may not be factoring in some of these foods you enjoy, and you may be actually sabotaging your own progress by doing that. You may be restricting so heavily that that's what's causing you to then crash and burn. So the repetition is key. Try to do your prep on the same day every single week with consistency. Again, the same thing applies to if you're going to have a little bit of chocolate every day. Have it every day if you know it works. Make sure if it is fitting into your meal plan, or if it is fitting into your macros, if it's working and it is something that is sustainable, keep it. Make enough meals to last you until your next meal prep day. So important. I can't tell you how many times clients tell me, oh, I've run out of meals. You've got your work roster for the next week. You know when your days off are, and if you don't, you might have a 1 hour window here and there to do meal prep. If you do your grocery shop at the same time each week, then you'll have enough food to carry you through to the next week if you're looking at your portions and things. If you do your meal prep for 7 days, right, you've then got enough time to tie you through to your next day off. Or if your next day off is varying, well then make enough to get to that day, make 4, and then you will obviously then be able to do meal prep on that day when you get to it, and so on. Again, allow some foods into your macros daily that you enjoy, that you know that you can track, or more macro-friendly versions. So maybe you love chocky, maybe you like cheese, you know, but it's chocolate. It's like, you don't have to eat the whole block. You can have a row, or you can have a couple pieces. It might feel weird doing that the first time, but if you do it daily, you no longer miss it because you get to look forward to it, and it's always there each day. When you wake up again, you get to have it again. How exciting. Or if it's cheese, you could have a light, low-fat version of that cheese on your meal and make it part of a meal so that you can still enjoy that food item. But obviously, it's going to be more macro-friendly. That way, you're less likely to reach for these calorie-dense versions of these meals or snacks outside of your macros, and this becomes less frequent. Again, it is proven that if we incorporate some foods that we enjoy, in fact, if we try and make most of our diet foods we enjoy, we're probably going to want to stay on that diet. And if we aren't enjoying it anymore, we want variety, change your food up until you get to a point where you are more consistent and happy with those food choices. So, balance whole foods with fun foods. The 80-20 approach seems to be a more successful and allows for a longer adherence to a plan than 100% clean foods, okay? And it's not necessary to eat clean all of the time. I hate that concept. Like, I used to be that person. 10 years ago, I was like not eating anything except broccoli and quinoa and eggs and chicken, and it was so clean to the point where I would not have anything processed or packaged. It was really extreme. It's not necessary, okay? It's also not necessary to eat in the other direction. So you still need to have, you know, your 2 and 5 fruit and veggies, so 2 fruit, 5 veggies a day serves, not just a mouthful. Plenty of water and whole grains, nuts, seeds, and lean proteins in your diet. You still need to have that whole food variety, but the fun foods kind of come on top. They're kind of the little bits on top, yeah? That's why the food pyramid supports this concept. Don't neglect whole foods altogether when eating flexibly to hit for fit macros, right? I've seen clients do this where their diary looks like they eat like a toddler. It's like chicken nuggets and, chips, and they might have cereal for breakfast. And it's like, hold on, it fits your macros, but you're very malnourished from a perspective of micronutrients because you're not even eating anything remotely green, and you're probably having some digestive problems without that plant-based fiber to help you go. So you can slowly also from that as well slip back into old habits and find yourself super hungry because veggies actually help fill us up, or even lacking energy because of those micronutrient requirements and deficiencies. So it is all about balance always, but that 80-20 split seems to be the sweet spot for getting your micronutrients in, for getting some of the foods that you enjoy, and for hitting your macros and your total calorie requirements. Depending on what your goals are, will depend on how many calories you will need to consume for the day. If your meal plan is super restrictive or doesn't have much variety, ask your coach for some changes when they're due, okay? Or switch to macro tracking to allow for more flexibility within your macros daily. It's difficult in the beginning learning a new task like tracking, but it does get easier with time. And it's great for accountability. If your coach doesn't let you track macros or doesn't change your meal plan to help you fit your food preferences, find another coach. That doesn't mean if your coach doesn't include McDonald's in your meal plan, you need to fire them. But certainly if you find your coach is consistently only prescribing chicken, rice, broccoli, fish, asparagus, no, you're not allowed to have a burger out, no, you're not allowed to do this, oh, no, you can't have cheese for some weird reason, or, just really weird things that don't seem to add up. Like, hold on, how am I meant to go the rest of my life, without having, for example, pasta? Like, they just cut food groups out, just no explanation, they're terrible, but hey, they're still in the food pyramid for some weird reason. If your coach is doing that, find another coach. Remember, flexibility is about ensuring your dietary choices work for you and that you are not self-sabotaging, you're not obsessing, you're not guilting yourself, but you're also remaining realistic about your goals and your actions and efforts in relation to your results and what you achieve. Hold yourself accountable. If you've eaten like an asshole, it's probably on you, but there's a difference between eating like an asshole and having a flexible meal or a flexible day within reason. Life is too short to not eat birthday cake, okay? But it's not your birthday every week. It's not a party. Life is not all about having a fantastic, awesome, dandy time and smashing away every type of different food you could think of on a weekend and dieting during the week. Flexible foods outside or off plan or, not within your macros need to be given in moderation and also treated as though they are something that is special, absolutely, if you're in a calorie deficit. If you're in maintenance or surplus, it should be encouraged as a more regular part of your life and something that will help you phase out restrictive eating behaviors if and when necessary. So that's it from me. Thanks for listening to this vlog. Looking forward to doing another one for you soon. Bye.